Writing tips, dialogue formatting, use of commas, embedding a setting, etc. Writing dialogue, content. So, dialogue is not necessarily required to follow formal sentence structure or grammar. It's really supposed to be realistic, and not everyone uses perfect grammar and perfect sentence structure all the time. So, when you're writing dialogue, you don't necessarily have to worry about that, depending on the character. Each character should have unique dialogue that shows their personality and their motivations. Ideally, you will be able to tell a character apart just by their dialogue. Dialogue should also sound natural and realistic at all times. So here's an example. I pulled all these examples from the story I'm currently working on, just, kind of some average examples. So here we go. Quote, "What a terrible plight. We would be glad to provide assistance," Jorah assured him. So this quote, he speaks formally and kindly, and he offers to provide assistance. That alone tells you enough about his character. He's a formal person. You don't know this, but he is a member of the Royal Guard, which is why he's willing to help anyone really in the kingdom. I don't know, other stuff. Basically, it tells you apart a few specific characteristics by just his mannerisms and the way that he speaks. Here's another example. "Oh, brother, here we go. It's always something," Caesar sighed. Now this shows you that Caesar's a little rascal, right? So he is less formal than Jorah by a large amount, and he's always whining about something. And these are just two random quotes, so you see the point that I'm trying to make here, is that you should be able to, in some way or another, distinctify the dialogue to the characters. So dialogue format, this is tricky. We got a couple slides about this. Quotation marks at the beginning and the end of direct dialogue, which is when someone's speaking. Punctuation may go within the quotation marks, unlike when you're inserting a quote within an essay. It's different in this case, because you're not copying someone else's work. You're writing a story and someone is talking. So you can end your, put your punctuation within the quotation marks. The dialogue tags, when necessary, belong outside of the quotation marks. So dialogue always begins with a capitalized letter. It doesn't matter where in the sentence it is. It can be the beginning of the sentence, it can be the middle of a sentence, it can be the end. But no matter where it is, it always starts with a capitalized letter, because dialogue is essentially its own sentence. Interrupted dialogue, which is basically when you have dialogue going and then you interrupt it for an action or a tag, and then you continue it. The second half of that does not need to be capitalized. Anytime a new speaker begins talking, no matter how brief, it should be represented with a new paragraph. So you want to space and tab that. So here's an example. "I made a new record today," Orion offered proudly while they ate. "Oh yeah? Which branch?" Zyvon raised his eyebrows. 16. "Wow, branch 16 already. You'll be at the top in no time." So dialogue tags can range from a simple he said or she replied to a specific description of an action or an expression, which is used obviously in this example. Tags are not always necessary. See, when two characters are going back and forth, like in this example, you can often allow the dialogue to breathe and let the context speak for itself. Like, you can tell here that when Zyvon asked him which branch and he answered 16, that doesn't need a 16, Orion said, because it's fairly clear that Orion said that. And the same goes for, "Wow, branch 16 already. You'll be at the top in no time." That is Zyvon. However, if a new character were to be introduced, then they would need to be distinctified, because you wouldn't know if you just start putting tagless quotations in. So here in this example, this follows the dialogue that was in the past example. Yuna cleared her throat. "Orion, you know I don't like you climbing that tree." So you have to put Yuna's name in there, because otherwise it seems like it's just a conversation between Orion and Zyvon still, and things would get confusing because the dialogue doesn't fit the characters. When ending a quote with a dialogue tag, use a comma rather than a period. If the quote is punctuated with an exclamation point or a question mark, you don't have to replace these because they're specific and they mean a certain thing to the sentence. So these should stay. But if it's a period, you replace it with a comma, assuming there's a dialogue tag following. If it's the end of the sentence and there's nothing following it, you can keep the period. Here's an example. Uh, Orion asked, "Where are we going?" "You will see," Zyvon replied calmly. So you see, right before, after the dialogue tag, and right before he begins the quote, you want to put a comma, and then in the same case, reverse, the dialogue goes here, comma, quotation mark, and then you got the dialogue tag. If that were to be an exclamation point, then you would put an exclamation point instead of the comma, everything would change. But because that sentence was meant to end with a period, you replace it with a comma so that it transitions smoothly into the tag. Commas. A comma should be used when you want the reader to pause briefly without ending the sentence. Example, Orion shrugged. "Yeah, I guess." Note the difference between "yeah, I guess" and "yeah, I guess." A comma indicates a brief pause, whereas a period represents the end of a thought or a sentence. If you need to check if you have placed a comma properly, just try reading the sentence out loud. You should be able to tell if the comma is properly placed by how the sentence reads. If the pause is awkward or unneeded, you can drop the comma. If a pause would be beneficial, you can consider including one. Use a comma between each element of a list. Example, oranges, apples, bananas, and blueberries. So you got a comma in between each one, and in the last one you always add an end. Use a comma between two adjectives preceding a noun. Example, he stared up at the tall, dark building which towered over him. Comma goes between tall and dark, which are the two adjectives describing the building. Use a comma between two independent clauses separated by a conjunction. Example, I love a good scare, but that movie was too much for me. I won't get into the whole details of clauses, they're very complicated, but essentially the point here is that this is its own sentence. I love a good scare. You could very well put a period there, and that's a full sentence. And the same is true with that movie was too much for me. These are both independent clauses. They don't rely on one another, but because this conjunction here, the word but, it ties them together. And since that is there, you need the comma. So I love a good scare, comma, but that movie was too much for me. So alternatives to a comma. A semicolon can be used to connect two short sentences which are closely related in subject matter. Example, I was so close this time. I really thought I had it. Essentially, when you're using a semicolon, you could also be using a period to end the sentence, but if you want to portray strongly enough that the sentences are connected to each other in subject matter, you can use a semicolon instead. It switches things up a little bit, and it shows that the two sentences are directly related. Embedding descriptions. So show rather than tell should always be on your mind when you're describing a setting or really anything in a story. Describing a setting in advance helps to set the stage for the part of your story which will occur in that setting. The intricacies of the setting likely will not be conveyable fully in this way, though, just initially discussing it. For this reason, and to remind viewers of the setting, details should be embedded into the story. This can be done in a range of ways. Here's a couple examples that I have, just basic examples. This is incredible, he mused out loud, laughing. A lazy, balmy gust tickled his skin. This just reminds you where he is. In the middle, he's just giving a little dialogue, and there's an action. But it's just a quick reminder that he is in the woods. There's a calm breeze. It gives you senses a little stimulation, and it brings you into the world a bit. Here's another example. So the two walked off into the woods together. The sun shone brightly through the trees. It's just kind of trying to portray here that it can be just a little tidbit here and there. It tends to go a long way. Description. Painting a scene with words should be the goal rather than just listing the features of a setting. The five senses, not just sight, which is the one that people mainly tend to focus on, should be appealed to. These senses connect people to the story and engage them in its world. Scent is most closely linked to the memory, and as such, it's the most sure way to connect a reader with your story and bring them into your world, despite being one of the trickiest senses to write. It's very hard to properly write and describe smell, but it is closely linked to the memory, so if you can plug smell, then it will connect with your readers. So it's worth a try. Here's an example I have. The grass here was greener than anywhere else, the air softer, breeze gentler, the scent rich and refreshing. The environment felt tangible. The kind aroma flooded his senses and relaxed him. I've just got a couple other tips I thought I'd review real quick. So be aware of your character's goals and personality. They should be reflected in their actions and words throughout the story. And it's important that you don't get lost and your characters all over the place. Building an immersive setting will enrich your characters and your story. Using a variety of sentence structures, dialogue forms, and some non-linear story elements such as flashbacks keeps a story interesting. Punctuation makes a big difference in how a sentence is read. These small things are important. It's easy to forget when you get in a row and just sentence ends with a period, but if you really want to portray your words the way that you mean them, it's important to remember basic things like sentence structure and punctuation. Have fun. If you don't like what you are writing, you should not expect other people to. That's a rule of thumb. It's important to keep that in your mind. I mean, why would you expect someone else to like your story if you don't even like it? It's pretty basic. You always have to start somewhere, so just be patient. Just write as much as you can at first and say what you want to say. You can always, and should always, go back and edit later. Changes will happen. Final drafts are often hardly recognizable from the first draft. So even if you're not satisfied at all with your first draft, it's not worth sweating over. I mean, revisions happen. They're necessary. They'll change your story for the better. So just don't worry about it. Just write your story. You can fix it later. And any questions, anybody? No questions.
Pretty much self-explanatory of all that stuff. That's all I wanted.
Well, I must be a darn good teacher. Well, thank you everybody for your time. I hope you've learned something valuable, and good luck writing.